Well, it's a privilege to be with all of you today, and thank you for your extraordinary leadership and contributions. I'm going to be talking about new models in social enterprises against this background. We have 45 million people in the United States living below the poverty line, and I think it's impossible to consider public health issues without being cognizant of the implications on poverty and the implications of poverty on public health. Similarly, I think education is a directly connected issue. So rather than looking at public health in a vacuum, I propose to look at it in the context of the societal problems we all face. And in specific, my remarks will focus on the capital formation challenges, the way in which to engage the private sector, the business community, the investment community in funding innovative solutions within the public health arena. To do that, and I apologize doing this so early in the morning for you, but I need to start with a little tax law. Not only tax law, but ancient tax law. If we go back to the mid-1960s, we had a situation where private foundations, grant-making organizations, which then as now receive significant tax benefits, primarily in that monies going into the foundation were tax deductible on the returns of donors, yet the earnings within the foundation wrapper were generally exempt from federal income tax. Well, those benefits were afforded foundations because of the expectation that they would distribute cash for charitable purposes. However, up until the late 1960s, there was no specific statutory requirement that foundations make any distribution at any particular time. It was just an overarching expectation. So in 1969, Congress, as part of the Tax Reform Act of that year, for the first time, imposed upon foundations the duty to distribute at least 5% of their assets annually for charitable purposes. This is what accounts for the feverish competition for grants among charities. Well, what is less understood is that at the same time, Congress created an alternative means by which foundations could satisfy that distribution requirement. And that is a specialized form of investments that foundations can make called program-related investments. And the first strategy I want to describe to you is tied significantly to this program-related investing opportunity and how that works in driving positive social change and ameliorating the most vexing of social problems we face. So the foundation today can do either meet its 5% distribution requirement through grants, through program-related investments, or through any combination of the two. Program-related investments are an exception to the rule that otherwise would require foundation managers to manage assets as fiduciaries, ensuring that their portfolios are diversified, that they secure a reasonable rate of return, that there is appropriate collateral in place where appropriate, and so on. Here we're dealing, in fact, with speculative investments, high-risk investments that otherwise would subject the foundation and its manager to a tax for having jeopardized the mission of the foundation. And why is that? It's because the investments that qualify are themselves charitable. And here I'm using the expansive definition found within Section 501c3 of the Internal Revenue Code. So you can establish a business that pursues one or more of these activities. The foundation can assist in funding that business, and that funding will count just as if the foundation made a grant. Now, the program-related investment cannot have as its primary aim the production of income or the appreciation of assets. However, interestingly, there is no cap on either retrospectively or prospectively. However, program-related investments cannot be used to support or oppose candidates or campaigns or platforms or planks. Obviously, we're using tax-subsidized money here, so one candidate versus another ought not be advantaged. There are lots of ways in which program-related investments can be designed. Historically, most of them have been loans. When they are loans, we're talking about 0% loans, 1% loans, typically made to 501c3 charities. But we can also be talking about loan guarantees, loan participations, other kinds of structures. Any security that can be designed as a program-related investment, including equity investments. Now, when I say that, immediately it should be obvious that I'm not talking about charities any longer, because charities, of course, have no equity to sell. We're now in the for-profit mode, and we're going to talk about how the L3C, the low-profit limited liability company, capitalizes on this opportunity. This first is a list of some of the program-related investments in which my firm has had a hand, either representing the foundation, the business, an impact investor, or some other player around the social venture. And you'll notice, although not each of these directly and clearly calls out public health, each and every one of them, I would argue, has a public health implication and a public health benefit. And here are some more. And these are all program-related investments that have been funded either as debt or equity or hybrid securities by foundations in whole or in part. Which brings us to the low-profit limited liability company. This is a new statute. I drafted many of these laws. There are 9 states today that enable companies to be set up as L3Cs. If you happen to be in a state that does not yet authorize them, you have the ability to organize an entity in one of the 9 states that does. And at that point, register it as a foreign entity in your home state. So this strategy is available anywhere in the country, and indeed also globally. And I'll explain how that works in a minute. But the L3C is a specialized form of LLC, limited liability company, which is the most popular form of doing business in the United States today. So it's no accident that the LLC was selected as the predicate for the L3C. It shields its owners from the debts of the enterprise. It provides flexibility in terms of tax treatment, and it also allows for allocation of rights and obligations among participants so as to ensure that everybody's getting the benefit of his bargain from a governance perspective. Now, the statutes which prescribe the requirements for L3Cs track the Tax Reform Act of 1969's requirements for program-related investments. And so will the Articles of Organization creating the L3C, and so will its operating agreements. So we'll find that typically we'll have one or more for-profit members, think of shareholder or owner, and one or more nonprofit members. It will have a charitable or educational purpose, because that's what program-related investments must fund. Would not have been formed except for that purpose. It's not intended to produce income or grow wealth as its primary aspect, the theory being that we're using tax-subsidized money. If this thing could carry its own, let's tap into venture capital in the first instance. But it may produce significant income or appreciation, and many of these do. In my experience already, those that are knowledge-based business, where the intellectual property is expansively defined, nurtured, then leveraged through various rollout strategies, social enterprise franchising, strategic alliance, replication, those are seeing the quickest and largest early returns, and no political or legislative purpose. The L3C's promise is to shift the economic risk away from a charity. About half of the L3Cs in the country are tied to 501c3 charities. Charities today are finding that they must become more self-sufficient. They must become more self-reliant. They cannot depend on foundation money alone. If you look at the aggregate assets of foundations in the United States, they have not yet returned to their 2006 high water mark. So for the charities to perpetuate their ask, let alone increase it, is problematic. Similarly, of course, government has its own fiscal challenges. So this is an opportunity for charities to become more autonomous, more self-sufficient, and more sustainable by embracing earned revenue strategies. When they do that, increasingly they are establishing L3Cs or similar entities to hold those earned revenue strategies for asset protection purposes, but now also to shift the economic risk and the financial heavy lifting to foundations and other investors. So we're using foundation money catalytically Foundations are foregoing market rate returns. They are obliged to do so. If it is a debt, I explained it's going to be nominal interest rate. Similarly, if it's equity stake, it's going to be a disproportionately low equity stake vis-a-vis its investments. By virtue of the fact that the foundation is foregoing market rate returns, it is effectively subsidizing returns to other investors who come in concurrently or subsequently. The theory now is to move from a philanthropic model toward an investment model, to engage the private sector investment community into social purpose ventures. So that's about half of the L3Cs in the country. There are about 600 of them now. The other half are freestanding social purpose businesses, many of whom are depending on program-related investments. Others are looking to brand themselves and position themselves as social enterprises with the belief that they will then be favored by consumers and other counterparties. So it encourages financial self-sufficiency. The foundation will often act as a social venture capitalist, providing not only money, but expertise, relationships, infrastructure, and standing by the social purpose business will itself give comfort to other investors that, hey, this is real and we have deep pockets behind us. It will be a leveraging technique, and I'm going to show you how this works because all of these strategies are heavily reliant upon leveraging, and they all should be. And the theory is here to drive a double or even triple bottom line result to a venture that has perhaps modest financial prospects, perhaps greater than modest financial prospects, but always the expectation of significant social impact. And it becomes a win-win for all stakeholders. So I'm going to show you a hypothetical construct. These are plug-in numbers with make-believe players, just to show you one example of how this works in action. So we have here on the horizontal axis, we're going to look at financial returns, social returns, and on the vertical, financial returns. The first player coming in this example is the foundation. It's incurring the highest financial risk. Why? Because it is seeking primarily social impact. That's its mandate. It earns a 1% financial return, but a high social return in its judgment. Before the foundation invested, there was no money in the till. By virtue of the foundation's participation, you will see they will now shore up the capital structure of the venture and entice other players to join. Now we have a socially conscious investor. It might be an individual, it might be a business that comes in at the next layer. They're supportive of the social mission, but they want to have some financial return too. So we have a mixed objective. In this example, the mezzanine investor is going to get a 3% financial return and, of course, a piece of the social return to its credit. And then finally, we have a market-driven investor, doesn't give beans about the social impact. These are the guys we need to bring in. That's where the real money is. So we are able to give this market-driven investor what I'm calling a market rate return, 6% in this example. This venture will kick out, it is assumed, 4%. No great shakes. If we had a startup that was kicking out 4% on financial grounds alone, I don't think anyone in this room would invest. But here, everybody gets what they're after. And it's all because the foundation's money was used catalytically. But for the foundation, the private sector investors would not have been engaged. Who's a candidate? Any venture that is charitable or educational in this broadest of all senses. So when we talk about innovation within public health of various kinds, the L3C is a logical candidate. The venture must demonstrate that it's going to have consistent cash flow. Not large cash flow, but predictable cash flow sufficient to meet its obligations to all of its stakeholders. And it needs to be entrepreneurial because of necessity. We're talking here about a startup or an early stage venture.